A quick note about today's sermon. As you all know, I do sermon at an early service and a late service. Early service had a lot more time, so the sermon was much longer, but it meant I was able to get into both readings. I'm simply today going to take on the first reading. If you're curious how they're interrelated, I would watch the sermon at the first service too, okay? And I bring that up because part of one of the things I talk about a lot is how the World War II generation whitewashes things. And they whitewash it to our own detriment because they took a Bible that dealt with really complicated things, really real things, really part of things that we have in our hearts that we struggle with as humans, and ignored the parts that were gray. But if you ignore the gray parts of life, you ignore often the things that really matter. Because black and white things are relatively easy. It's why they're black and white. The gray parts are where things live. So I want to delve today into the Genesis passage. Because the Genesis passage has this text of terror in it that is really problematic in Christian history, but also shines a real difference between us mainline Protestants. When I say mainline Protestants, I mean Lutherans, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, United Methodists, the Moravians, and the evangelical non-denominational world. Because we approach the Bible fundamentally differently, and as a mainline pastor, I would say ours is better. Now, they would say theirs is better too, so take that for what it's worth. But let me explain why. In today's passage, you have this horrible moment in time, this series of curses. Now, to give you a background, what we're dealing with is the end of the Adam and Eve story, right? We all know Adam and Eve are created, and they're wandering around, and Adam's like naming animals and all this, and then eventually they eat the fruit, and they get kicked out of the garden, right? We all know that basic thing, but we have this moment where God comes in and says, all right, folks, I caught you. You ate it. Everyone does the kid thing of point at the other person. They made me do it. And God's like, I don't really care. Everyone, you got to now live in the real world. Now, there's a thing about living in the real world. This is part of what it means to become an adult, is realizing the real world, right? Like there's a moment in time in which you probably thought to yourself, man, work is hard. I now understand why they give us money to do this. Right? There was probably a time you're like, I now understand why my dad said not to go ahead and leave the refrigerator door open all the time. Right? Or save for taxes, or any number of things that as a young person you might have looked at your parents and gone, and then only to grow up and be like, oh yeah, that makes more sense now. I mean, if you're a parent, how many times have you quoted your parents, no matter how much you said you would never do that, right? Okay. This is that conversation where God's like, all right, folks, you're going out into the world. Let me tell you about the world, because you've been living in paradise and you don't realize it. And so he goes through these things. Now you can understand it as curses. I mean, they're sort of curses the same way getting the lessons of the world is a curse. It ain't fun. And what does he tell Adam? He says, Adam, when you're in paradise, there's always enough food just laying around. In the real world, you got to figure out how to feed yourself. And figuring out how to feed yourself is going to be hard work. Agriculture is rough. You're going to be scraping food out of the ground to put together enough to eat the bread you need to live. And then you're going to get up the next day and you're going to have to do it all over again. Hey, snake, you know what? When you're not in paradise, there's a lot of things that want you dead. You're going to bite the heels of the children, and the children are going to stomp your head. In other words, I don't know about you, when I'm on my riding lawnmower and I'm going, I see one of those suckers, I just go right for it with the lawnmower as instructed by my wife. Okay? Why? Because humans, snakes, we don't get along, and that's okay. It says to the woman, childbirth is going to be hard. It's going to be painful. Here in paradise, it isn't that way, because that's how it should be. It shouldn't hurt. But it does. Any woman who's given birth can testify to that. Now, here's where things go awry in history. And this is where we and the evangelicals separate out. See, we understand, as do they, that just because it's hard to feed yourself doesn't mean you can't work on making it less hard, right? We both are perfectly fine with going ahead and having modern agricultural techniques, right? No one in Lutheranism or evangelicalism says, no, you have to do it like the ancient people, like with a sickle, right? We don't say that. No one in either community goes ahead and says that you shouldn't go ahead and get medication so that childbirth doesn't hurt as much, right? No one out there says, oh, you should just let snakes bite you. It's what God meant, right? Those would all be insane things in either community. And yet, evangelicals will take that line of wives, your husbands will lord over you, and say, now that one you should just let happen. And we go, now hold on, why should you just let that happen? Isn't that a curse just as much as the fact it's hard to grow things, just as much as snakes will bite you? Isn't it just something that is wrong about the world? See, another way of understanding these curses is to understand them as things to be conquered. We pray every week, God's kingdom come, right? That the world slowly inches, moment by moment, inch by inch, towards being a more godly place, being closer to that Garden of Eden. See, Garden of Eden is the goal. These curses are the thing between us and the goal. We are just as called to feed the world as we are to end men lording over women. This is part of our mission in Christ. Now, those of you who come from evangelical or non-denominational worlds will step in and say, now, hold on, didn't Paul have a lot of bad things to say about women? And I'd say, oh, yeah, man, he really did. But you know what he started off with? He started off with citing this particular passage. He will start off and say, just as we learned in Genesis, and that's why I have these views. Well, if Paul is wrong about the Genesis reading, then everything he says after that is also incorrect, right? It's fruit from a poisonous tree. This is a hard thing to deal with because then that means there are things in the Bible that got misquoted or misunderstood by the writer. We allow for that because we allow for the fact that humans are humans and humans are imperfect. We can trace how this misunderstanding occurred, where it occurred, and why it occurred. And so we can accept as mainline Protestants that, it's not just that this statement is incorrect and Paul's takes on this statement are incorrect, but in fact, it's not just that he shouldn't have gone that far, but it's something completely different. The completely different thing is not just that men and women are equal, not just that women are not supposed to be put under men the way evangelical non-denominationals do, but rather that is a sign of sin in the world that people are treated unequally. And therefore it is our calling in the Lord's Prayer as we try to make the kingdom come to end that inequality. It is as much a core part of our Christian mission and duty to promote equality as it is to feed the world, as it is to help the poor, as it is to fight for justice. In fact, I would argue it is one of the core justices we are called to fight for, outlined right off the bat in the Bible. I don't think that's a mistake. You may be wondering what the World War II generation has to do with it. The Revised Common Lectionary, which is what decides what we read each week, stops right before the curses. It tries to ignore this whole problem. Now, it tries to do that because it's we don't want to say this text of terror. Yeah, but it's not just not a text of terror when you really read it. It is actually a call towards justice when you actually read it. And so I don't look at their attempt to avoid this conversation as a good one for the church. Because when you avoid the actual call for justice, you avoid helping more than half the population of the world that is treated unequally. You avoid a whole slew of good, important, meaningful conversations that people should be having with each other. You avoid moving to where the church should be, which is a church that speaks out and says, humans are humans, they are children of God. And we need to talk about how we misunderstood this purposely for a lot of years. Now, evangelicals, non-denominationals are going to disagree with me. They're going to say, these are a whole bunch of curses. And I'm going to say, you're absolutely right. And I'm going to say, but then why don't you have why aren't you following the Amish out there? Why aren't you trying to cut things out? Why aren't you going ahead and doing this? And they say, well, Paul. And I'll say, well, Paul's basing it off of this. And then they usually just stop talking to me. Because what they don't want to do is actually read the Bible. See, evangelicals will often stand up, non-denominational, and say those mainline Protestants, they don't read the Bible, they do all this theology stuff. And I'll say, folks, I'm not bringing any outside theology. What I'm doing is I'm actually reading the whole thing and then asking questions. When you actually read the whole thing, not just the snippets that the church says, you find that the Bible is very different than what people tell you it is. Because in the evangelical church, the pastor stands between you and the Bible. Here I say, everyone just go read it. In the non-denominational church, they interpret it for you. I said, go read it for yourself. This is my interpretation of what works for me. Disagree with me, that's great. Agree with me, that's wonderful too. But go out and read it. Because over and over and over, what you're going to find is that the Bible itself really, really fights against injustice. Really, really cares about the poor. Really, really sees everyone as a child of God. Over and over again. And too often Christians have neglected reading it and not realized these real messages that are really there. So as you go out this week, take a few minutes in your life and ask yourself, have I ever actually sat down and read the Bible, just like started at the beginning and worked my way to the end? If your answer is no, and by the way, we know from polling that would be 98% of everybody, then I'd encourage you, skip the parts you've already read, and make sure you stop every time you run into something new. And read it. If you get stuck with questions, stuck with concerns, come to me. Go to your friends, go to your families. Go to people who know. Try not to go to the internet. The internet doesn't know things. But go to those people in your community. Ask those questions. Have those conversations. Because what you're going to find when you actually open it is pretty remarkable and often surprising. Amen.